This project started with one simple objective: make side tables to match the coffee table. But anytime a client gives me free rein to design what I want, simple seems to take a back seat. So today I'm making a pair of complex wenge and curly maple side tables that speak the same language as their coffee table counterpart, but with their own twist. After multiple design revisions and 9 hours of footage, I've got something that feels right. Tables with sharp lines, gorgeous figure, and just the right amount of attitude. The story of these tables actually starts with a bunch of wenge scraps. The client brought me a pile of leftovers and told me, make me a coffee table, design it however you want. And of course, I went wild with it. You can see the full story of that coffee table build in my previous video, which I'll link below. But here's the quick version. We ended up with a killer coffee table that he loved. When he picked it up, I went to return the rest of the scraps and he hit me with the perfect question. Do you want to build some side tables to go with it? And naturally, I said, absolutely I do. We even mocked up some ideas right there on the whiteboard in my shop and came up with this idea, which a fellow furniture designer friend agreed was indeed Nakashimish, which felt like a good start since the coffee table design was influenced by renowned furniture designer George Nakashima. Now, designing something to match an existing piece isn't always easy. The challenge isn't just creating something that looks good on its own, but making sure it feels like it belongs in the set. You want the pieces to have a design language that ties them together. Same materials, similar shapes, complementary details. For this build, I already knew that I wanted to use curly maple again, just like the coffee table. And I wanted to bring back some of the angular features and joinery that I had going in the coffee table. But the rest, that's where the struggle began. At first, I thought I could push the angular design even further and maybe go for a cantilever style. That sounds pretty cool, right? I gave it a shot and even made 5 different versions of this, but it just didn't feel right. Too chunky, too heavy, and still somehow unstable. And here's a valuable lesson I learned in my journey as a designer and problem solver. Sometimes it's better to just start from scratch rather than to try and polish up a mediocre idea. So that's what I did. The coffee table was the best thing I've ever designed to date. So I decided to take it as a starting point and see what would happen if I just smushed it into side table proportions. But that didn't feel like enough either. It was kind of boring. Like I was just repeating myself without adding anything fresh. So I went back to the drawing board again. I tried a conoid approach, letting the legs cant outward, but that felt pretty odd too. It wasn't until version 8 that I finally hit on something that clicked. The bottom stretcher and feet stayed the same, but now the tables stand on a central pillar. The legs taper outward in both directions, giving it a dynamic and yet balanced look. It feels like it's got a strong presence, but still has that delicate touch in its proportions. I also had a great idea for a really unique feature on the tops of these, but we'll talk more about that later. And don't worry, I did clean up that vestigial glue on the end there. Sometimes with projects like these, I don't always know where to start. So I like to just pick something that's really obvious and get things rolling. The existing panels I had contained some quarter sawn boards for some reason, so what you've been watching me do so far is cut those out and remake those panels to rough dimensions using just the face grain boards and glue up those quarter sawn offcuts to make my blanks for the bottom stretcher of the base. One of the great things about approaching the project this way is I know when I get these done, I can just set them off to one side, and by then I will have had enough time to think about what to do next. One of the most visually interesting parts of these side tables is the legs. So before I worked on any of the other curly maple parts, I wanted to make sure that I found the board with the most interesting figure to use for my leg blanks. And once I found that, I hand selected the sections I wanted to use and started breaking them down and milling them. Back to this idea of not always knowing what to do next, I realized by saying that I could be betraying a lack of intentionality or planning in my projects. And, well, fair enough. I don't plan out every minute detail of my projects, but I do make plans, and pretty detailed ones for that matter. I just don't put steps in order that don't have to be in order, and therefore I sometimes put myself in a bit of a choose-your-own-adventure scenario. In this case, I picked Make the Legs page 4, so I turned to page 4 and started down that path. So now we're going to follow that storyline as far as we can go for now. So the legs have a lot going on for this design. They have the rough dimensions, but then they taper in two directions. Each leg is straight on one side and tapers from the top toward the bottom, and also tapers equally across the face. The interface is also going to be veneered with wenge, which I think is a nice, subtle accent, which we also have on the coffee table. Making the taper on the face side would have been really tricky to do by cutting it directly on either the table saw or bandsaw, and I also had 4 of these to make, so I wanted a highly repeatable solution as well. So I made this planing sled that basically jacks up one end to the precise height necessary to achieve the 2-degree angle I needed to put on these, and then lets me carefully plane each one to the same thickness. Something didn't feel right when I got done attaching this lip on the end. There, that's better. Okay, here's a big win for my Jessam stock guides. This curly maple had a ton of tension in it, and on a few cuts it was threatening to pinch the blade and kick back. But it wasn't a big deal since I was able to just set up my stock guides and keep moving along safely. If you don't have something like this for your table saw already, I'll put a link in the description for it. I highly recommend having some hold down accessory to keep you safe when making cuts on tricky material like this. Now I could finally plane the legs into shape. It's funny to me how often I'll spend 3 to 4 times longer preparing for an operation than the operation itself actually takes. Once I had everything in place, planing all these down probably only took 15 minutes or so versus the hour I spent working on the jig and roughing out the leg blanks. The next stage of the legs adventure was to make up the veneer for the inner faces. I just got a few new bandsaw blades, including this giant 1-inch resaw blade. Now the upside to getting a new giant bandsaw blade is it's really sharp, and I know I can count on making these cuts being a breeze. The downside to a new bandsaw blade is it's really sharp and coiled up like a spring that you have to carefully uncoil without hurting yourself. No, unfortunately, I still can't do this safely. So let me know in the comments if you have some advice on how to unfurl a bandsaw blade without hurting yourself. After what felt like another hour of setup, I had the privilege of making an 8-minute long 6-inch resaw cut on this incredibly hard wenge. Thankfully, I was able to get one slice out of this board that covered 2 legs from that single cut. For the other legs, I cut 4 narrower strips off the stretchers and glued them together edgewise to avoid wasting it, since my stretcher blanks were wider than they needed to be. To get these down to the proper thickness for veneer, I sent them through the drum sander until they were around a 32nd of an inch thick. So what I'm doing here is actually a joining technique I've seen guitar makers use when creating top and back panels for guitars, where you basically sandwich the mating edges together and joint them at the same time with a hand plane. This basically lets you get a really tight glue joint because jointing both edges at the same time ensures that both edges complement each other perfectly. Since these are so thin, the best way to achieve clamping pressure is to strap the edges together with blue tape and use these plywood panels and a cinder block as my clamping cauls to keep it flat. I found that this pre-finished plywood is a great material to use for this kind of glue up because any glue squeeze out won't stick to it permanently. I cleaned up the glue residue with a card scraper and sanded them to 320 with the orbital sander. Attaching the veneer to these was complicated. I don't have a vacuum bag, and clamping things that have angles on them can be tough. Luckily, I have pairs of angle things to clamp up and figured out a system to do each pair at the same time. But I needed a lot of clamps. By stacking them and rotating them 180 degrees from each other, this negated the angles and gave me clamping surfaces that were parallel to each other. I also clamped it directly to my work table with my pre-finished plywood boards between, which ensured everything stayed really flat and that the legs didn't stick together. The only really tricky part was getting it to stop sliding around while clamping and maintaining a margin of veneer around the edges for trimming later. I learned my lesson last time about how to flush trim this wenge. Wenge is really brittle and wants to shatter when it's routed. So I made an effort to cut the end grain by hand and just used this huge flush trim bit on a low RPM to ensure I got clean cuts all the way around. Okay, so far on the legs portion of our Choose Your Own Adventure story, we've tapered the faces of our leg blanks, made and attached some wenge veneer, and trimmed them up. Now it's time to cut the other tapers. And to do that, I'm using this tapering sled. I took my time on this first one in order to set the correct angle for the fence and added a stop block behind the workpiece. Since I have to do this for 4 legs, this will make the other 3 just a matter of popping it into the jig and clamping it down. To cut the other side, I just repeat the process of lining up the marks I made on each end along the cutting edge and clamp these down tight. Then it was a matter of repeating this process 3 more times for the other legs. One thing that's really tricky about highly figured material like this curly maple is its tendency toward grain tear out. But you can overcome that tendency with a super sharp plane iron as long as you've read the grain correctly. And this sharpening system has completely changed my relationship with my hand planes. These are ceramic stones and only need a little water for lubrication instead of having to use oil or soak them in water before use. Being able to touch up my micro bevel in about a minute means I don't hesitate to grab my planes now. When I finished the legs, I had to choose the next path in my adventure book. So while I was deciding what to work on specifically next, I took a short side quest titled Generally Mill Up Other Maple Parts. These parts will become the feet, top stretchers, and cross supports that make up the rest of the base. And with a few more parts roughed out, it felt right to resume working on the bottom wenge stretchers I glued up earlier. These needed to have some domino mortises cut out for where I'll attach the feet, as well as an angled recess on each side that the legs will fit into. Back on this theme of how thoroughly I plan out my builds, here's an example where I actually over-prepared. See, my original thought was that these legs should be held in place with dominoes on both the top and bottom. So here I'm cutting dominoes in with meticulous precision for these top and bottom mortises. And to be honest, using dominoes on top and bottom would have worked fine. But as you'll see later on when I go to assemble these bases, it turns out it was both easier to assemble them using only the top mortises and honestly overkill from a strength standpoint. These legs have long grain glue connections everywhere they touch the other base parts. The dominoes ultimately just make the glue up easier by helping me keep the parts from sliding around while I get the clamps on. For some reason, of all the little subplots on this side table building adventure, I found myself looking forward to this part. You saw me marking these out earlier using the tapered legs to set my layout lines. Well, these middle sections are getting routed about a ½ inch deep so each leg can nestle inside its own little wenge nook. And these little acrylic plates are perfect for on-the-fly routing templates for operations like this. I made 3 passes on each of these to just nibble away at it because the wenge is really hard, and also because my templating bit is only like 1/4 inch long. And now that I say that out loud, I also feel obligated to say, no need to leave me a comment telling me how long your templating bit is.
Anyway, it took a while, but when all 4 of these were done, the level of precision I was able to achieve by doing it this way was pretty dang rewarding.
With the joinery on the stretchers done, I came to another fork in the journey. And since I'm a dad with young children, I'm just going to use terminology that's familiar to me. So this chapter is going to be called Footies. This might be the first time that I've made a part for a project that has 0 right angles on it. Even the footies on the coffee table had right angles because in that case I had designed them to interlock with the base stretcher in a way that created at least some internally. On this one, I decided to abandon the personal challenge to not use the domino and instead challenged myself to use the domino, but in this case, on parts that ultimately get assembled without right angles. The key to making this work, of course, is to cut all the domino mortises a little longer than necessary to start with, and to make them all before cutting any of the angles onto the parts. And if you're wondering how I'm going to clamp these onto the base stretcher later on, at this point in the build, so am I. But I did find a solution for that, which I'll share in a minute. But first, I had to work out cutting an angle onto every side of these footies. As you'll see, the cutting operations themselves aren't that complex, but the order of everything matters here. So first, I'm using my tapering sled again, and you saw me set up some custom stop blocks with double-sided tape. Those don't provide any clamping force here, but they do make it really easy to set up the other 7 of these that I have to do. This first cut I just made is the main bevel that runs along the top of the footy. Now you might wonder why I would stop and hand plane these right now, since I'm going to be cutting angles on all sides. Well, I said the order of operations would be important. This is the last time these footies will easily clamp into the vise. Seems to me like a great time to plane the bottom and main bevel faces. However, this is not the last time that they'll be in the vise. I still have a few tricks up my sleeve that I'll show, well, right now. To put the next round of bevels on the footies, I needed to be able to run them through the table saw both parallel to the table and also upside down. So the bottom of the footy is facing up, due to the direction my table saw blade tilts. So to solve the parallel problem, I just taped on the offcuts that I had saved from making the first round of bevel cuts, and that worked pretty well, apart from the dust spewing from my saw like a geyser. Also, did you know the word geyser is spelled Geyser? I may or may not have come with at least 2 other wrong spellings before letting spellcheck correct me on that. And the other problem I had was all the spiky offcut chunks that weren't connected to anything that threatened to become projectiles had I not been using a riving knife. So, safety first, right? With all those cut, I used my little offcut trick again to put these back into the vise and hand plane the side bevels. And I've got to say, using a super sharp low angle block plane on curly maple is really satisfying. Like, it's so smooth you could lick it, which I do not recommend. Okay, with all the footies done, I could turn my attention to the top parts of the base. This is the top stretcher that will hold the other ends of the legs and will have half lap joints on either end for 2 of these other parts, which of course will be the table's little armies. And this is why it's a bad idea to make your layout lines based off of dimensions from plans. Despite all your efforts to make parts to exact dimensions, by the time you plane and sand away perfections and tear out, especially in curly maple, your parts won't be exactly those dimensions. For joints like this, it's always better to do any final sanding or planing first and use the part itself when making layout marks. In the past, I've depended on a dado stack for this kind of operation, but this time I happen to have just finally bought myself a nice miter gauge. The one that came with my table saw was basically crap, and when I got this one, I literally threw the grizzly one into the trash because I don't have a neighbor that I could torture by giving it as a gift, promising that it would make square cuts. This is the Jessom Miter Excel 2, and I've got to say, like all Jessom tools, it is fancy. I won't go into full tool review mode, but suffice it to say that it was the hero of this part of the build. There's no slop in the miter slot thanks to its built-in adjustable bearings. The fence was super easy to square with the blade, and the micro adjust on the stop block is just incredible. I promise I'm not sponsored by Jessom, I'm just a bit of a fanboy. But Jessom, if you're watching, I'm very open to being sponsored. So you might be noticing that I'm not cutting to the full depth of my layout marks here. This is intentional. For one, I'm not using a square tooth blade to hog out the bulk of these joints, though that would have helped. But I chose this approach so that I could make a perfectly flat bottom on these by once again using the router. I suppose I could just use the router for the whole operation, but since it made the most sense to cut the sides of these with the miter gauge, it wasn't a big lift to go ahead and just remove most of the waste while I'm here. One approach I picked up while routing these out is to place spoil boards on the sides of the joint that help to prevent tear out. And since the sides of the joints are already really flat, my respectably sized template bit bearing could just ride along those interior faces and clear out the remaining waste and make these joints perfectly smooth. One big takeaway from the coffee table build was just how sketchy my first attempt at cutting bevels on the stretcher sides was. I explained the questionable approach in that video, but the gist was that I used a sacrificial fence to extend my table saw fence height, giving the stretcher corner something to ride against for the final bevel cut. My error was that it was too short and could have allowed for kickback to occur. For this build, I came up with a better solution, modifying my trusty Jessom stock guides to attach a longer sacrificial fence. This way I was able to attach a taller fence to my saw without using clamps that could have gotten in the way of my stretchers during the cut. I make these bevel cuts in a couple of passes on each side. So doing it this way takes the pressure off me, the workpiece, and the saw. And here as I make the final pass, you can see that I had to adjust the fence a little to line the blade up with the initial kerf, since we cut a whole kerf off the other side. This is 4/4 poplar. So why do I need 4/4 poplar in this build? Well, I'm preparing to work on the cool thing I said I had planned for the top. My current problem though is that I need more 8/4 curly maple and only have this 5/4 board left. So for those of you who have no clue what I'm talking about with these numerical quarters, 5/4 is just a fancy woodworking way of saying it's 1¼ inches thick. Anyway, it's too thin to use for the little decorative touch I'm going to add to these wenge tops. So before I could really start working on that feature, I had to make myself some plywood. And if you're thinking these chunks of poplar and curly maple are too thick to work as plywood and wood movement is going to be an issue, don't worry. I looked it up and it turns out that poplar and maple have almost the same exact tangential shrinkage percentage. This means for air-conditioned seasonal movement of kiln-dried poplar and maple, you could expect a 10-inch board of poplar to move 0.082 inches, or the same size curly maple board to move 0.1 inches, for a difference of around 0.02 of an inch seasonally. So the difference in expected seasonal wood movement is negligible. So with that data in mind, I confidently glued up my little plywood chunk. And because only one edge of this curly maple was very curly and I need enough for 2 tables, I rotated the bottom panel 180 degrees from the top so that I'll end up with 2 strips with a lot of the same kind of figure on each side. Okay, I'll stop teasing you about this fancy feature for the tops. Basically, what I'm going to do with my curly maple plywood is weave a strip of curly maple into the tops so that they look like they have a little organic looking curly maple lake in them, where the ends of the maple are still surrounded by wenge. I experimented with this technique in a previous video using some walnut scraps, and it turned out pretty cool, so I want to do it on these tables. It's a design risk, but it's unique, and that's what I'm going for on these tables. And depending on how they turn out, this could be the only time that I ever use this design feature on a table. So the way I'm going to do this is to make a couple sets of templates and then cut and template route both sides so they match. Now, I know some of you might be wondering why I'm not just using the method where you stack 2 boards and cut them at the same time, like plenty of folks have done for these fancy woven cutting boards. I go into greater detail on how and why I did everything to make this work in my previous video, but the short version is that I want these lines to be really curvy and somewhat organic looking, rather than just smooth curves. And template routing offers a lot more control over the lines I end up with versus just cutting them out on the fly. And this is the other reason.
All right, so this sort of sucks. I've broken my 1/4-inch bandsaw blade. I wondered if that was going to happen because for whatever reason, I think because this is really thick and because it's wenge and it's really, really hard, it wasn't able to cut it like quickly enough to make the turns or something like that. I couldn't get it to like bite when I was turning it, and so it was just twisting the blade inside of the kerf, which obviously applies a lot more pressure to that saw blade. Not really sure why it happened, but I'm gonna have to pivot a little bit and figure out how to get these done. Maybe with a jigsaw, maybe a different bandsaw blade. We'll find out.
I didn't have another 1/4-inch blade, so I just grabbed my jigsaw and took my time ripping through this wenge. It's pretty tough to do, and it took a lot longer than what I'm showing here. There's also blade deflection to worry about with the jigsaw. I can cut directly on my line at the top, but usually the blade exits the bottom somewhere that isn't perpendicular to the top face. Thankfully, in this particular case, all the blade deflection happened to be away from my cut line, which just meant I had more material to route away at the bottom than at the top. Had it been going the other way, it would have been a big problem because then I couldn't route it back to a square edge. As you can see, I do have a longer templating bit. And once I routed as much as I could with it, I moved over to the giant flush trim bit on the router table. And for the safety sticklers out there noticing that I'm making some climb cuts here, I'm actually doing it on purpose. See, wenge is a really brittle, splintery wood. So when you need to route away big chunks, its tendency is to blow out and shatter when running the bit in the right direction. But by taking several really small, short climb cuts, that is, moving the workpiece in the same direction as the bit is spinning instead of against it, you can safely remove the bulk of that extra material and then make a final pass in the right direction to clean up the last little bit without creating a bunch of unwanted tear out. While I finish cutting and routing the other side of the little lake, I want to take a minute and say thanks for watching this far. I'm really grateful to all my subscribers and folks who watch these videos, but in all honesty, I wouldn't be able to keep making them without my amazing clients. So I just want to throw it out there that if you'd like to join that group of wonderful folks, I'd love to talk with you about making a piece of custom furniture for you or someone you know. I'll put a link in the description to a contact form that you can use to get in touch with me. And for a limited time, if you use the word wenge in your project description, I'll know you found me through this video and offer you or anyone you refer a 15% discount on the project. And yes, I realize that I could be signing up to give someone a discount of $1,000 or more. But if that's what it takes to keep doing this job I love, sign me up. So you can see how this process works. With my templates in hand, I draw a line, rough cut it with the jigsaw, template route it with the handheld router, and flush trim the rest on the router table. Glue everything up, and repeat. I really like the idea of letting every piece I make truly be one of a kind. So as I was finishing the last glue up on the first top, I decided to make a different template set for one side of the second top, and here's how that one turned out. I might like this one a little bit better, but I do think as a pair, letting them be slightly different will give them a little more character as a set. With the lake feature in the tops all done, I felt a little like the hero of my story who had battled through all the small chapters of his adventure and finally accomplished his quest, and now had only to turn around and make the journey home. There are all these little details that could stand to wait until all the complicated stuff was done, but are more or less simple to do, like the rest of these angles, a bit of sanding, and a few edge details like a little 16th inch roundover. But there was still one obstacle left to face. I had to work out a way to clamp these angled footies onto my angled stretcher. It would be really hard to just slap a clamp on there and actually get even clamping pressure on it that would ensure everything stays straight. Thankfully, I watch a lot of YouTube and recently saw how Chris Salamone solved a very similar problem by making these cool clamping cauls that wrap around the footy and matches the angle, and also leaves a little hole to avoid crunching the toe of the footy, I guess. So I quickly threw these together from some scrap plywood, and after working out that I needed to clamp them directly onto the footies first, they performed perfectly to get all the footies glued up nice and straight. After installing this first leg, I remembered something very important. The inside faces of the legs would be really hard to apply finish on after assembly, so I took a minute and wiped on a coat of Osmo before I continued. This is always the part that you want to see when working with curly maple like this. It's really fun to know this beauty is there the whole time you're making parts, even though it's temporarily dull and gray looking. But when you soak it with oil like this and see that shine, it's like finally receiving the payoff for all your effort. The last leg of the journey toward home is putting some final details on these tops. The only remaining element of the coffee table's design language we need to get these tables to speak is the edge profile. There's nothing extraordinary about it, it's just a plain 45-degree underbevel. And I've used it on several projects at this point. But without it, these tables would look too chunky and top-heavy, and wouldn't look nearly as cohesive when placed next to the coffee table. Alright, now we just have to put a little finish on it and show you how it turned out. You know, we never really think much about what our furniture says. And most of the time, despite what we might think, it's not talking about itself. And neither is it talking about the coffee table it's sitting next to. No, it's talking about us. These tables say something about my client. He likes unique, rare, one-of-a-kind things. They say something about me as a designer. He likes offering his take on a celebrated style like that of George Nakashima. Maybe even he likes to take risks. But I think most of the time what tables like this say is, please don't put that drink on me without a coaster.